So have you all ever noticed how crosses are everywhere? And it's like Sam was saying, I mean, we hang these ancient symbols in our homes, on our front doors, in our offices. We hang them around our necks. You know, I was at the gym the other day, and I was noticing all the tattoos, which isn't really anything new because it's like in today's world, everyone has at least one tattoo. But I was noticing particularly how many of those tattoos were crosses. So many of them. So it's been a long time since I've surveyed the congregation. Just if you're willing, just raise your hand if you have a tattoo. Okay, a little less than half maybe. Stand, if you're willing, would you just stand if you have a tattoo of a cross on your body? Oh, come on. I know there's more than one. I'm standing with you. You're not alone. Okay, you can sit. Let's embarrass ourselves for just a moment. Here's what's so crazy about this. Here's what's so crazy. The cross is a first century Roman execution device. So we went into a tattoo parlor. And here's what I didn't say to my tattoo artist. I never said, oh man, you know what would be really cool? If you could just put a big guillotine right here, that would be awesome. You know what I'm saying? I didn't say to my artist, man, if you could just draw up a really beautiful electric chair and let me put it right here. No. We asked for crosses. Why? Here's what else is really fascinating. Companies spend millions of dollars on logos that they hope you will recognize and remember. And they only last so long, don't they? They have a shelf life. The cross, this ancient symbol, has endured hundreds of years after its inception. And we all know what the cross means, don't we? I mean, we all know the message of the cross. All you got to do is get in your car and start driving down I-80 towards Nebraska, or driving down I-70 towards Missouri. And you see homemade billboard after homemade billboard after homemade billboard, usually in a cornfield, and it has some image of Jesus and a cross sending us this message, and sometimes it's quite literal with the text. Jesus died for you to pay the price for your sins. It should have been you that died, but God was good to you. So God didn't kill you. God instead sent God's Son to die your death on a cross. And if you don't believe any of this, then sorry, hell's in your future. And you know, I can't help but think, like, how is this the dominant story that was passed down to us? I mean, how do we get there? And is there another way to think about all of this? And see, we have to remember when we're going through the New Testament scriptures, we have to keep in mind that they are real people talking to their people or writing to their people in a very particular time and place. Like we see in the book of Hebrews, chapter 9. There's a verse that says this: Jesus has appeared once for all at the end of the age to remove sin by the sacrifice of himself. And if you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute, what in the heck do we do with that? What in the heck does it all mean? Yeah, I asked that same question too. But let's put some context to it. Because in those days, this was a revolutionary idea. Because in those days, people on a regular basis would sacrifice animals. They would bring bulls and goats and sheep up to the altar, and they would sacrifice and slaughter them to provide a blood sacrifice to the gods. And you think, man, that's crazy. Well, we don't do that. Well, of course we don't do that. But central to their belief system was that God must have been angry, for instance, if enough rain wouldn't be falling on the fields and their crops weren't producing, therefore your family couldn't eat. Someone, you or someone around you, must have done something wrong, and God is angry. So the question becomes, how do you get God to be unangry? How do you appease this God so that this God will make it rain? Easy. Billy has to go get a bull, bring the bull up to the altar, and sacrifice it, because apparently God needs blood out of the deal. So you see how revolutionary This idea is in Hebrews when the author comes along and says, no. What Jesus did on the cross, those are old days. What Jesus did on the cross, it makes this system irrelevant. You see what I'm saying? Makes the whole thing irrelevant. So now fast forward to the year 2017. And when we gather in places of worship and we sing songs like, what can wash away my sins? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Beautiful song, isn't it? And there's nothing wrong with it. It is not immoral. It is not, it's not offensive. It's certainly not anti-scripture. But that image doesn't exactly resonate with us today, does it? That image certainly doesn't hold the same power it would have had 2,000 years ago. Why? Because last I checked, none of us were bringing sheep and bulls and goats up to the altar to provide some sort of blood sacrifice. There's another voice in the New Testament. In his letter to the Corinthians, the Apostle Paul talks about the cross as an event that was powerful and foolish and scandalous. And here's how he says it. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Christ didn't send me to baptize, but to preach the good news. And Christ didn't send me to preach the good news with clever words, so that Christ's cross won't be emptied of its meaning. The message of the cross is foolishness to those who are being destroyed, but it is the power of God for those of us who are being saved. Jews ask for signs, and Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, which is a scandal to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. So you see, when we start asking questions like, well, which image is right, and which perspective of the cross is right, it's not exactly a helpful question. Because we then have to ask questions like, for who? Like which people group, which culture, which century, which year are we in? So the better question for us to ask is, what images and what language will we use to help us communicate such an extraordinary event from 2,000 years ago? Such an extraordinary event that is still happening today. So for the next few moments, I want to explore the cross through the image of death and new life, and with this overall image of rebirth. And to do so, we're going to use the help of one of the greatest films ever made, Cool Hand Luke. So let's turn to Cool Hand Luke for just a moment. If you haven't seen it, you've got to watch it this afternoon. If you haven't seen it, let me give you a bit of a synopsis. The film begins with Luke cutting off the heads of parking meters. The film is showing us very early on that this is a man who goes against the system. He's sent to prison, and while in prison, early on in prison, he takes on this challenge and wins the bet to eat 50 hard-boiled eggs, which we saw on the film clip at the beginning of the service. 50 eggs, 50 prisoners. It's a bit of foreshadowing, because then he lays in the crucifix position, foreshadowing that his death will actually save the 50 prisoners. And Luke is constantly defying the system. He's constantly defying authority, highlighting a system of power and why it's so corrupt. And see, Luke, he becomes the hero to his fellow prisoners, because he escapes several times. And each time he escapes, he's caught by the authorities and brought back to the prison where he's beaten within an inch of his life. And every time he becomes more of a hero figure to his fellow prisoners. Even the dragline, who is the big burly guy, the former leader of the pack. And see, Luke, he represents freedom and liberation to them. But he becomes a major threat to those in power. You feeling me? He represents freedom and liberation to his fellow prisoners, but becomes a major threat to those in power. Does this story sound familiar? So Luke escapes one more time. And this time, Dragline, on a whim, jumps in the prison truck with him, and they drive off, but things don't end well. See, Luke and Dragline, they split up. And Dragline presumably gets caught, and he leads the authorities to where Luke is found. And see, Luke is in a church, and he's praying. He's pleading with God for another way. Very symbolic of the Garden of Gethsemane scene when Jesus is pleading with God, praying. And the final act of Luke's death brings a sense of liberation to the prisoners. So we're going to watch the scene in just a moment, but I want you to notice in the scene there's the lead guard who they call Boss, and they often call him throughout the movie the man with no eyes because he's always wearing these reflective glasses. He's never seen without the reflective glasses. So I want you to notice that it's a scene that represents that the ones in power, the ones inflicting the pain, they're the ones who can't see what's going on. Notice what's shattered after Luke's death. Take a look. What we've got here is a failure to communicate. Did you know that ranks as number 11 as the most quoted movie quotes of all time? So Luke is gunned down by the spiritually blind, the man with no eyes. And then Dragline, if you notice, he does something that shows us that Luke has freed him from all the fear of the guards. He rushes and attacks the guard, and the glasses fall off, the symbol of evil, and then it's crushed, suggesting that Luke's death has liberated the prisoners once and for all. You see, is it possible? Is it possible that the cross is about death? Old things dying, old things being shattered, so that we might experience new life. Old things being shattered so that we might truly see what God is up to in the world. Is it possible that the cross, the symbol of death, is the greatest symbol we have for freedom, liberation, and the fullest kind of life? Is it possible that when you see the image of the cross, that something deep within you longs for new life? Something deep within you longs for things to be different, for rebirth. You see, some things have to die if we're to truly live. Some things have to die if we're to truly see what God is up to in the world. And it all sounds a bit scandalous and foolish, doesn't it? My brothers and sisters, have you ever felt like you were in a prison, stuck, and it was just the same old, same old? The same past regrets keep coming up. The same past pain keeps coming up, and these things hold you captive. And joy has become impossible to find. I mean, what things need to die so that you might experience the fullest kind of life? And my brothers and sisters, does it ever feel like the same old injustices just keep coming up in our world? Like we saw over the weekend, like we're seeing now. Charlottesville, Virginia. Young white men, and I say young millennials, marching in the streets publicly, collared shirts, nice polos, with torches, shouting racial slurs. I mean, church, this is where we have to use our voice. This is where we have to name the powers, name the evil. Racism is evil. White supremacy is evil. God is always opposed to it. Some things need to die. Some systems need to die so that others might experience the fullest kind of life. You know, a mom called me this week, And she was in tears. And she told me that they had just lost their boy. He didn't make it. And see, her next sentence I thought was really odd. I couldn't figure out why she was telling me this. She said, my son was gay. And I thought, this is odd. I just knew him a little bit. I talked to him a couple times over the phone. Why are you telling me this? And then her next sentence let me know why she said that first sentence. She said, so we can't have the funeral at the church. I mean, you know what I mean? When your heart just sinks. I drove home that afternoon thinking, where did we go wrong? Big C Church, where did we lose our way? How did we wander off the path so far? Some things need to die so that others might truly live, so that others might experience the fullest kind of life. And see, my fear is, if we are the ones in power, or if I can just use my I language for a moment, if I am at the center, because I'm not exactly a marginalized person, then what it means is I can't always see. I can't always see what God is up to in the world because things stand between me and seeing. And see, those things need to be shattered. They need to be crushed. And I can't do that on my own. It's why I need the cross of Christ. There's another story in the New Testament, in John's Gospel. And it goes like this. John chapter 3, there was a Pharisee named Nicodemus, a Jewish leader, and he came to Jesus at night and said to him, now keep in mind, Nicodemus is a Pharisee. He's a man with great power and wealth, and the storyteller John is telling us that he comes to Jesus at night. Nicodemus can't see. And he says, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one could do these miraculous signs that you do unless God is with him. Then verse 3, Jesus answered, I assure you, unless someone is born anew, and I think we have this verse on the screen, unless someone is born anew, it's not possible to see God's kingdom. Now, if this language bothers you, if you have all kinds of baggage with this, well, then just give Jesus another chance. Stick with him for a moment, because essentially what he's saying is you cannot see what God is doing in the world unless you are born again or born anew. It's this Greek word, anothen, and it means to be born from above. You cannot see what God is up to in the world without rebirth. So Nicodemus asked, how is it possible for an adult to be born? It's impossible to enter the mother's womb for a second time and be born, isn't it? See, Nicodemus can't see. He's taking Jesus literally. So Jesus answered, I assure you, unless someone is born of water and of spirit, it is not possible to enter God's kingdom. Whatever is born of flesh is flesh, and whatever is born of spirit is spirit. Don't be surprised that I said to you, you must be born anew. God's spirit blows wherever it wishes. You hear its sound, but you don't know where it comes from or where it's going, which is really great language, isn't it? Because essentially what Jesus is saying is, when it comes to this death and new life stuff, when it comes to the rebirth, there's a bit of mystery to it all. You can't put these things in hard and fast categories. To which Nicodemus responds, how can these things be? To which Jesus responds, you are a teacher of Israel and you don't understand these things? You see, if you want to see what God is up to in the world, then you're going to have to experience rebirth. And let's just be real clear about it. Rebirth isn't just about change. I mean, change may be good, change may be needed. But rebirth is what happens when something dies and then something resurrects. And see, you cannot have rebirth without having a death. And you cannot have a death if you are still clinging to everything that needs to die. Is it possible that the cross, the symbol of death, is the greatest symbol we have for freedom and liberation and the fullest kind of life? Death is the engine to new life. You have to have death before you have resurrection. You know, I was in a texting conversation with a good friend of mine, a mentor of mine for the last 15 years, just last week. And to give you a little context on this conversation we were having, we were talking about how to communicate the gospel to the people. And he was calling me out just a bit, like only good friends can do in your life, because I was getting a bit clever with my words, like the Apostle Paul talks about. He said, Ryan, you don't have to do that. What do you mean I don't have to do that? We live in a different kind of... Ryan, you don't have to do that. Here's his exact text message that he sent me. He said, you're a pastor. You bid people to come and die in anticipation of resurrection, right? You're a pastor. You bid people to come and die in anticipation of resurrection, right? Mm-hmm. Yep. And I hate it when other people are right, don't you? So I want to give you the same invitation that I believe Jesus is still giving us. Come and die. I mean, what are the things that need to die so that you can experience the fullest kind of life? I mean, what are the systems and the things of this world that need to die so that we collectively might experience the fullest kind of life? And how do you know when rebirth has happened? A different story is being told. Here's how the film ends after Luke's death. It's a new story. And again, I want you to notice the cross imagery at the end and who's on the cross. Take a look. Y'all saw the cross, right? I don't have to explain that? Okay, good. Did someone just say no? The road. So the streets were making a cross. And then the picture of Luke was imprinted on the cross. Oh, now you're going to have to watch it again. And you're going to say, oh my goodness, how did I miss it? Back to our original question. Did Jesus sacrifice his life for you, for me, for the world? Yeah. Yeah, to show us how to live, to show us the way of death and new life, to show us the way of rebirth. The cross is always about a new way of being in the world. So I want you to just take a couple of moments, and you're going to hear a song. It's by a group called Page CXBI. They take these old hymns and they do a bit of rewriting and reworking with them. And I want you to reflect on the message of the cross. What happens when you survey the cross?